Okay. This meeting is going to be live streamed. We are now live. Welcome to everyone in the room. Welcome to those on Zoom as well. As I mentioned in my Shabbos Shuvah Drasha, that this year corresponds to the 30th Yurtzeit year of Reb Soloveitchik, died in 1993, and also was born in 1903. So this year is the 120th anniversary of his birth. And I committed at that time to resolve, we hope that New Year's resolutions go well. So my Rosh Hashanah New Year's resolution was to spend some time reviewing, learning, teaching the works of Reb Soloveitchik. I've tried to do so in different opportunities, different venues. And one of those venues has been the preparation of this series of classes on the essays. So I would say some of the most seminal essays that were compiled, that were delivered by Reb Soloveitchik in his heyday. This essay, if those who read it, again, afterwards, tell me, both those on Zoom and in person. You don't have to tell me now. I'm not going to, by raise of hands who read the essay, I'm not going to do that. But if you want to give me some feedback about to what extent people read the essay, understood the essay afterwards, so that I'll direct and prepare my remarks and the source sheets accordingly. Gave a little bit of this. This is an experiment, a little bit of a review of the essay as well as putting it into context and to give it some understanding overall. By preface, I would say that I never met Reb Soloveitchik. I was in 8th grade when he died, and I started Yeshiva University High School the following. So he died in April. I was on the YU campus beginning in September of that year. I do have memories of seeing Rav Aaron Soloveitchik, the Rav's younger brother, who began giving shiur as the Soloveitchik at Yeshiva University, and he would commute from Chicago to New York, just like Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik would commute from Boston to New York. And I do have memories of him. I also have some vague memories of Rav David Lifshitz, who was also a contemporary of Rav Soloveitchik. But I'm a student of the Rav, right? That's where I fit into the. Again, we are all part of this glorious tradition, this glorious Masorah that Rav Soloveitchik in other writings writes so beautifully about, the interface of the generations. Well, he'll speak, and the Rambam walks into the room, and his grandfather Chaim walks into the room. Some of these beautiful depictions and images of being part of that Masorah. I'm part of that Masorah as well. So are you. All of us are part of that Masorah. My place in that Masorah is as a student of a student. But nonetheless, when I reread this essay of catharsis, and I think about some of the pivotal, seminal ideas that define who I am, that I remember throughout my lifetime grappling with, thinking about that's really who I am. The idea of the heroicism of humility, the idea that things are not always or not generally black and white, the idea that there is that wielding power is sometimes yielding power, that recoiling is just as important in the world, holding back, as much as it is charging forward. These are ideas that I've always thought of as part of who I am and what I relate to. And then and then I'm like, oh, this is where the Rav writes about it. These are the ideas that emerge here. Of course, the essay of catharsis was really a talk, as often was the case. Soloveitchiks and Briskers more generally were very reluctant to write things down, because they were always to write essays, to write lectures. They were always thinking about how that will look in perpetuity, what, in 10 years, let alone 100 years, they'll say about the writings. So those things that the Rav put pen to paper and agree to is a section of what we have available, and then we have a lot of transcripts of talks that he gave, and we have and it runs the gamut from talks that were delivered in a formal setting to conversations. There's a whole genre of literature surrounding Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik of casual conversations that he had that were written up either word by word or the general gist. Um, David Hollander from Miami Beach has a series of books, The Rav Speaks, and Rabbi Adler has Rav Soloveitchik would have a shamus, would have an attendant that would drive him around, drive him to the airport, and each attendant would utilize that opportunity to create a personal connection and ask questions and find out more about topics of interest. And many of those attendants, the last attendant being Rabbi Kenny Brander, that's one of his many claims to fame, is that his role as shamus for Rav Soloveitchik, certainly leverage those personal connections and relationships and teachings that they learned in that context. But then you have lectures that the Rav gave, like the lecture that he gave on November 18th, 1962. It's my son Yaakov's birthday. He wasn't born in 1962, but it is his birthday. So we're talking 62 years ago. This was a lecture that Rav Soloveitchik was invited to give at MIT by the Hillel at MIT. So it was a Jewish audience, but a Jewish audience that was well versed in the broader world. It wasn't yeshiva bacharim. It was MIT students of the 1960s. And that's also an important point. I don't want to editorialize too much, but when it comes to mind, I definitely want to share the idea that, this comes up often when we talk about what was Rav Soloveitchik's position on X, Y, or Z. Well, it depends on who you ask. And that's not to say that anyone's lying, right? No one's lying. Let's assume no one's lying. There's no reason to assume that anyone's lying, even though they heard different things. Because as I mentioned at the very beginning, this idea that life is complicated, that there's a lot of grays, that depending on the circumstance, the answer might be different depending on who's asking, why you're asking, what are the specific details of the situation that you're speaking about. So that, that all of those things make a difference. So the type of shiur, the type of presentation, the emphases that are put on elements of Rav Soloveitchik's presentation at MIT doesn't mean that he would say something completely different at Yeshiva University or Smicha students, but the emphasis might be slightly different. What are the pressing ideas that need to be conveyed given the audience? You know your audience. Right? That's a good thing to know your audience. It gets complicated when each audience thinks that what they heard is the only word to be said about the topic. And of course, Rav Soloveitchik, as his Lefi Darko HaKodesh, his holy way was to sort of reject that and to know that there's nuance, that there's complexity, that there's gray, that it's not monochromatic. That's a word that he likes to use in his essays, which means that it's not black and white. And different audiences need to hear different things, and different moments in his life may emphasize different elements of his philosophy. So, as another preface, I'm going to mention that already it was Hanukkah time that I shared an idea from Rav Soloveitchik that I saw quoted in a compilation, not a direct quote, but in a different context, about two brachos from Birchot HaShachar. The morning blessings of in the morning. Every morning we make a number of blessings. We thank Hashem for opening our eyes and straightening us out and allowing us to providing for all our needs, right? And there's one bracha that says Ozer Yisrael B'Gvura, that girds the Jewish people, Israel, with Gevura. Gevura is normally translated as strength. Let's go with that, but we're going to have to refine what that term means, because there's another bracha in Birchot HaShachar, which I just mentioned this evening between Mincha and Marav, Hanotein Laya'ef Koach, that we recognize, we thank Hashem for giving Koach to those who are tired. So what's the difference between koach and gevura? There has to be a difference between the two. Says Rav Soloveitchik, the difference between koach and gevura, he would translate the difference as koach is strength and gevura is heroicism. Right? You need strength. When you're tired, you need strength. But gevura is something that has nothing to do with how tired you are. Gevura, what's the difference between koach and gevura? So he develops it. The idea that when an army or when somebody goes to wage battle with a foe, with an enemy, so they need koach, they need strength to do so. When they are fighting a war that ostensibly based on the numbers and based on paper, they may lose, or they should really definitely lose, but they engage in that war anyway because it's they're fighting not for just victory, but they're fighting for a cause beyond themselves. That's gevura. That's being heroic. Right? And he says that that's when you talk about on Hanukkah, that the Ma'atim battled the Rabim, the few Maccabees battled against the great and mighty and numerous Greeks, Syrian Greeks. They were exhibiting heroicism. They were being heroes. Yeah, they needed strength, but they needed more than strength. They needed to be willing to see themselves as defending and the honor of the Jewish people, the honor of Hashem, that this was important because they were battling against Timaim, Rishaim, Zaydim, all the bad terms that we refer to the Greeks as, and that's why they were willing to live and act heroically. And so that's the preface for this class is this notion that according to Rav Soloveitchik, the halacha's central demand of each of us is to live heroically, to recognize and realize that we are living for something greater than ourselves, and moreover, the need to live a meaningful life may exhibit itself in ways that we would not necessarily expect. What do I mean by that? So he explains the difference. Everyone should have a source sheet. The difference between Greek heroicism versus biblical heroicism. Read it. This is a quote. Anything that's not labeled is a quote from this presentation and from this article of Catharsis. Right? The mere myth of the hero gave the aesthete endless comfort. Hero worship is basically self-worship, right? Greek heroicism is the grand gesture, something big that someone does, right? The Trojan horse that sneaks in. It impresses the audience. It makes the person famous or infamous, right? All publicity is good publicity. And therefore allows the actor who shows this type of heroicism, who acts heroic in the moment, right? It's not just 10 minutes of fame. They will be written down forever. They'll be remembered in perpetuity forever. They'll become famous for their heroic act. And of course, it touches on this idea that one of the drives that drives all of us is for immortality, which is elusive, right? It drives us, and it's impossible to attain in its literal form, but there are many ways to attain it in a more abstract form. The deeds we leave, the impact we leave, the progeny that we leave, biological or otherwise, the students we leave. There are many ways to be immortal. The Greek idea of heroicism was their way of being immortal by a grand gesture, right? And the idea that hero worship is basically self-worship is that those who watch the Greek audience, the Greek viewer who watches the Greek the story and sees the hero, they too share in his glory, and they feel that that's the ideal. That's what they hope to achieve, right? Hero worship is self-worship. I want to do that thing. I want to have that 5 minutes of fame that will allow me immortality, that will be with me. It has to be something big. It has to be something heroic in the sense that it's unique from everyone else, that'll allow me to be remembered. In contrast, or Salvation contrasts that to what he calls biblical heroicism. This is very important. Biblical heroicism is not ecstatic, rather contemplative. Not loud, but hushed. Not dramatic or spectacular, but mute. The individual, instead of undertaking heroic action sporadically, lives constantly as a hero. What are we called upon to do? We're called upon to live. It's not about the grand gestures. It's not about the charisma. It's about living a directed, goal-oriented, meaningful existence, day in, day out, week in, week out. That's how you become. That's how you become a hero. That's how you become a Jewish hero, and that's how you become. That's how we strive to achieve immortality. We live heroic lives by being moral and ethical and living according to halacha, with all of its expectations and all of its obligations and all of its restrictions. I give you this example because I remember this example. I heard of this example of what Rav Soloveitchik means by givura, being heroic, even before I ever saw this essay. It was something that my teachers referenced and always struck me. It always stood out. Right? It's the instance of bride and groom. Right? You can read it inside. Bride and groom are young, physically strong, and passionately in love with each other. Both have patiently waited for this rendezvous to take place. We're talking about the wedding night, after the chuppah, after the last dance, after Sheva Brachos, after the meal. They go back to their apartment. They go back to their hotel room for the first time together as man and wife. Just one more step and their love would have been fulfilled, consummated, if you will, a vision realized. Suddenly, the bride and groom make a movement of recoil. So they should be moving towards each other, fulfilling this, consummating this love. He gallantly, like a chivalrous knight, exhibits paradoxical heroicism. He takes his own defeat. There's no glamour attached with his thrall. The latter is not a spectacular gesture since there are no witnesses to admire and laud him. What happens? The woman says, I think I'm a Nida. Right? Unexpected, not what they were looking for, not what they were anticipating, not how they planned on spending their night. And what happens? And what do? They recoil. Soloveitchik says that is the epitome of this heroicism. Right? It's not a grand gesture where everyone's going to look at it, where it's going to be written down for history. No one's going to know about it. Right? No one's going to know about it. You think about, I think about Rav Soloveitchik's grandfather, Rav Chaim Brisker. Rav Chaim Brisker was known to be a tremendous mind. And he left a tradition of Brisker learning, of analytic and analysis and learning of Rambam and of the Talmud that thousands, hundreds of thousands are doing today. But you know what Rav Chaim Brisker wanted on his tombstone? Ish Chesed, a man who, took in children that didn't have a mother and father, who would take care of widows and orphans. You get any good PR for that, right? Any publicist would say that's a bad focus of your attention, because it's not going to pay off. You're not going to end up with it's not going to get a lot of likes on social media. Can you take pictures with the widows and orphans? And you say no, it's a private endeavor. Well, that's not going to help your platform, your persona, right? But that's the point. That's gevura. That strength, a little different than the example given, but this idea, there's no glamour attached with withdrawal. No one's going to know. No, it's just between him. No, right? Newlyweds. The latter is not a spectacular gesture. There are no witnesses to admire and laud him. The heroic act did not take place in the presence of jubilating crowds. It's not a coliseum. It's not a theater. No one's going to know about it. It's not going to be written in the history books. No bards will sing of these two modest, humble young people. It happened in the sheltered privacy of their home in the stillness of night. The young man, like Jacob of old, makes an about face. He retreats at the moment when fulfillment seems assured. What's the reference to Jacob? Reference to Yaakov, that night when he is struggling with the angel, the man, Vayaveki Shimo. Yaakov is struggling. The being, the man, the mysterious man wounds Yaakov, right? Gidanasha. And then Yaakov gets the best of him. Yaakov gets the best of him, and then the guy says, okay, mercy, let me go. Right? So if you're looking for the heroic gesture from the Greek tradition, the drama, what are you supposed to do at that point? You slay him. You knock him out. You give him the death blow. That's over. What Rav Soloveitchik explains this moment is, what does he do? He shows what Jewish kavura is all about. Lets him go. I mean, when you think about it, you take a step back. The Rav says, how does Jacob even know that the guy's not going to turn around and hit him on the other leg? He has no idea. But for whatever reason, that moment, maybe it was for that moment, maybe it was to teach all of Jacob's descendants that heroes sometimes are the ones that are willing to let go and not take advantage of that moment, but rather there's a greater value that's trying to be expressed through those through that opportunity. A prerequisite to halachic heroicism at times is overcoming the success-oriented activity, right? Goal-oriented, right? Wedding night, it could be viewed as a goal-oriented activity, and yet halachic heroicism tells you that at times it means to recoil, to take a step back. From Soloveitchik's elsewhere, it's been suggested that this is in line with an idea of the great philosopher Kierkegaard, when Kierkegaard talks about a leap into the absurd. What does it mean, a leap into the absurd? It doesn't mean that you would ever do something absurd, but it means that you're not always doing something according to one's natural sort of base animalistic desire to overcome and to be victorious. Sometimes there's another value that's coming out of this that is meant to emerge. And like Yaakov, he doesn't give the death blow. He lets the person go for another day. I want to take a moment to talk about the title of the essay, catharsis. Catharsis is a Greek term also related to the experience of the viewer or the attendee of a drama, especially of a tragedy. Catharsis means to purify or to evoke. According to Aristotle, the function of a tragedy, of a Greek tragedy, was for the audience to watch and to release. It would be used as a release for their own emotions in a controlled environment, right? It's good to sometimes you need to have that outlet. And if you don't allow that outlet in a controlled and healthy way, then it'll come out in more healthy bursts. So the idea of catharsis is to be allowed to express whatever that is, anxiety or fear or other emotions, and to get into the characters that they're seeing. That's Greek catharsis. For Soloveitchik, catharsis is something different. Catharsis is not the passive response of watching something go on around you, but rather it is an affirmative obligation of life in order to redeem our experiences. What I mean, another difference between the two, and this is something that Soloveitchik develops in Shiurim on Rosh Hashanah a number of times and in Yom Kippur, the difference between man as a subject and man as an object. Right? For the Greeks, man, everything's random. Everything's up to fate. Right? So why is something going to happen? You can't explain why. You're not an active director or producer in your own life story. And so therefore if there's a lot of feelings of helplessness, there's a lot of feelings of dread and anxiety. You need to let those out because there's nothing else you can do about it. You're an object. You're an object to the whims of fate, to the whims of the gods, whatever else is around you. The Jewish perspective is that that we're not merely objects, we're subjects. We're subjects in writing our own history and writing our own story. We're producers, we're directors, and therefore, if there are areas of life or areas of the human experience, the human condition, the way in which we exhibit or deduce catharsis is by redeeming those activities, those experiences, which will explain the Rav in this very short but action-packed essay mentions 4 areas of the human experience, of human existence, each of which can experience catharsis. And I would say that the model, the mantra that we should use, and really in the absence, we get a much greater, much deeper, at least I do, understanding of what this mission in Pirkei Avot always meant. Ezehu Gibor, what makes someone a Gibor, and that's the term we've been using. Well, who's a hero? HaKovesh et Yitzro, the person that is able to hold back, overcome his base desire, which often, sometimes it means to go forward and to be take a proactive posture, to do something that your inclination would tell you not to do, right? To run towards danger. That might also be heroic in the same way, right? That you're not only focused on self-preservation, but you're also thinking about something greater than oneself. But oftentimes, and this is what Salvation focuses on, it's not the going forward. The going forward, the attempt to dominate, the attempt to be victorious, to affirmatively address a situation and win, right? That's what's expected. That's what the Greek hero would do. And we're called upon a kovesh et yitzro. Sometimes kovesh can come from the word to brine, right? To allow something to be held back in abeyance, and that not to conquer but to hold back. And that's the focus of Rav Soloveitchik's example of Gevura. This sort of dance, the great dance between God and human beings, of coming close to God and then moving away from God, either on purpose or by accident, right? Sin moves us further away. Engaging in Torah mitzvot brings us closer, and it's not a one-way street. It's a dance that brings us back and forth. Sometimes we get close and God runs away. That's Shir Hashirim, and sometimes God's looking for us and we're not receptive. Sometimes we're moving closer and we're strengthening that relationship. There's a Rav Soloveitchik's essay, Vikashta Misham, you shall seek God from wherever you are, talks about that dance, that great dance between humans and the divine, of getting close and separating. The idea, right, on the one hand, that part of us is divine. So we have a desire to get as close to God as possible. But then we know from Moshe Rabbeinu that you get too close to God and you lose yourself. We're spiritual, but we're also physical. So there's that dance that continues all along, and therefore there is an expression of gevura in moving forward, in being affirmative, in being proactive, in engaging. But in the essay Catharsis, where Soloveitchik really focuses on, and again, this may speak to the audience, what was the message of gevura that Soloveitchik felt most important to convey to a group of Jewish students at MIT in 1962? We don't have to guess. We can guess why he thought it was most important, but we know that the emphasis was on gevura as taking a step back, gevura as withholding, gevura as recoiling from that which otherwise we would forge ahead for. So, and he gives 4 examples in terms of the human experience, and we'll spend some time. We'll take the second half of this presentation to explore each of them. The first one is the hedonic, right? Hedonism, pleasure in the world. The example that we started with of halachic heroism is an example of that. Bride and groom ready to consummate their relationship in a halachically appropriate way. All of a sudden they recoil. But as the Rav puts it elsewhere in his presentation, in the essay that we have, the stronger the grip of this physiological drive is felt by man, the more intoxicating and bewildering the prospect of hedonic gratification. the greater the redemptive capacity of the dialectical catharsis of the movement of recoil. In other words, the more physical something is and the more desirous a person has of engaging in that physical activity, the more halacha will encourage us to remember that there's an element of heroics that tell us to refrain. And what's important to note, and maybe we'll mention this again later, is that Rav Soloveitchik is not advocating for asceticism. He's not saying not to engage in the world. In fact, Rav Soloveitchik elsewhere talks about how Olam Haba, as great as Olam Haba is, right, the world to come, it's associated with death. And everything associated with death is tameh, is impure. It's something that we distance in this world in our lifetime. Right? So he's not an ascetic. He's not, speaking of the radical Islam that embraces death, we abhor death. We say that it's tameh. We fight against it, right? We know that it's part of our lives, and we have to keep it in mind as we live our lives. He's not saying to live an ascetic life. No, engage in olam hazeh, engage in all the pleasures of the world, but remain. Make sure that you don't become a slave to them. Kovesh et yitzro. Include in that perspective, the best way that we can maintain our equilibrium is by engaging in both enjoying the world around us and at times recoiling from it. And Rav Soloveitchik in this quote just notes that the more physical and the more yetzer hara, the more taiva we have, the more desire we have for something, the more it will be regulated by halacha. He says that's why there are so many rules associated with meals, with eating. Eating is such a base desire. You can talk about the sexual ethic as well, right? It's such a basic, natural desire that we share with the animals that we are called upon to redeem. Right? That's the catharsis, the hedonic catharsis that we're going to eat, we're going to procreate, we're going to engage in this world because Hashem said everything in this world is good. But the way we redeem it, the way we have experienced a catharsis in these areas is by doing so in a meaningful way, according to halacha, which at times calls upon us to refrain and to hold back and to first wash our hands and make a bracha. And after we eat, to make a bracha as well. And we don't just eat for ourselves, but we make sure other people have something to eat, right? That's simcha and Yom Tov. It's not just filling your belly, but also making sure that those less fortunate have something to eat and that are taken care of, right? All of these things are part of, even though eating is animalistic, right? Making sure it's kosher, making sure it's not milk and meat combined, going into the rabbinic rules of bishul akum and yayin and stam yayin. All of these things. Why are there so many rules, right? Somebody calls me and wants to know, right? Is the person from? So what's the definition of from? Shomer Shabbos and Shomer Kashrus. Why? Why? Isn't it also important to Ben Adam Chavero? Isn't monetary economic ethics also important? Yeah, it's true. But what sets us apart? The drive to achieve and work 7 days a week is very strong nowadays. So it was always, but especially today. The desire to fill our bellies in whatever way we want, however we want, whenever we want, very strong. That's why halacha modulates and regulates and redeems the area of this is hedonic catharsis, as Rav Soloveitchik would put it. The second type, beyond the body, right? The way that we redeem the activities, the desires of our bodies, of our mouths, is emotional, right? Catharsis of the and before we go into that, just to note that the goal, of course, is to connect with Hashem. But the goal is to redeem these basic drives in our human psyche, in our human experience, and that's called kedusha. Kedusha is translated as sanctity or holiness, but Kedusha is really also, Kedusha is always found with restraint. Something that is more restrained has more Kedusha, right? So like something that when you think about um, different types of priestly gifts, right? You have truma that the Kohen can eat anywhere. There are certain restrictions on that. There's more restrictions on a carbon, that because that's higher level of kedusha. It can only be eaten in the Beit Hamikdash by a Kohen for a day and a half. The more something is holy, the more it's restricted, and vice versa. The more something, for whatever reason, needs to be restricted, the more it is sanctified. And again, this idea that these restrictions are not handicapping our ability to engage in and enjoy the world, but allows us to have the equilibrium to experience it, gives us the freedom so that we're not slaves to our desires. Something that our guest speaker, Rabbi Wiederblank, mentioned about Paro. Right? If you say that God hardened Paro's heart, but he retains free will, maybe it's just that he wasn't overwhelmed by the plagues. Because right? The Nile turning into blood may have been an overwhelming experience that took away Paro's free will to make a logical decision on his own. So too, this idea that the restrictions, the gevurah that we're asked to, the halachot that we are asked to abide by, are meant to ensure that we're not slaves to our desires. That's famously why that the famous statement of Chazal, Ein lecha ben chorin el mi she'osik b'Torah, that the words of the Ten Commandments, God told Moshe to charut al pi hadibur, which literally means to engrave on the stone. Chazal say al tikra charut ela cherut, a word play. Don't pronounce it as charut, engraved on the stone, but cherut, freedom, because the rules that are incorporated, especially rules that allow for this catharsis, are the rules that allow for an equilibrium that enables us to live freely, to not just be slaves to our desires, or as we'll see in the next example, slaves to our emotions. The catharsis, if you turn the page over, the catharsis of emotional catharsis, here the Rav talks about that we have to, something that other people, it's kind of it's a toss-up in the world. Can you control your feelings? Right? Can you control your feelings? So the answer is yeah, you can control your feelings. Yeah, you absolutely can. The Torah requires it. When the Torah says, don't hate your brother in your heart. When the Torah says, don't covet, right? Don't be jealous of someone else's things. But I can't help it. Yeah, you can help it. How can you help it? Difference of opinion. It's a machlokas actually between the Ibn Ezra and the Sefer HaChinuch. Right? We'll go back to the first source from the essay in a minute. Let's use it as a framing thought. The top quote from the essay: the halacha thinks that there is an ethic, not only of action but of feeling as well. Man is master over his own emotional world, capable of disowning feelings of emotions, however compulsive or powerful, if they seem to be disruptive, and conversely, of assimilating redemptive emotions into his personality. Right? We can train ourselves what to think, and if we think a certain thing that is incorrect, right, or wrong, or detrimental to ourselves or those around us, we can think otherwise. So, two ways of understanding this. One is the Ibn Ezra. And the Ibn Ezra is what we might call cognitive behavioral therapy. If you think a certain way, think, feel, act. Right? Think, feel, act. Think, feel, act. And that's what the Ibn Ezra says, right? The Ibn Ezra famously asked on, how can you be commanded not to covet? Right? So he says, well, think about the fact. It's kind of like, does the poor person ever think that his daughter is going to marry the king's son? Of course not. That's ridiculous. You would never think that. So why should I covet your fancy car? It's not meant for me. It's a cognitive experience. You think correctly, you challenge your assumptions, you challenge your feelings, and you think them through rationally, you come to different conclusions. Certainly a possibility. The Sefer HaChinuch says otherwise. Sefer HaChinuch says it's willpower. Right? You think one way, think something else. You can think it. You have the ability to think otherwise. You can affirmatively introduce a thought, right? Because again, Gevurah is not only recoiling, but it could also be stepping forward in a redemptive, more positive, fashion, or it means stopping to think in one way or another. And famously, and I've shared this many times, and you probably have heard it in one form or another. The example that the Rav Soloveitchik gives is the example of, especially when it comes to the laws of Avelut, mourning, and Simcha, the joy that we are meant to have on a holiday. And he points out this is the area, not in this essay, but elsewhere. He says that every mitzvah, you've heard this from me, mitzvot, in the Brisker philosophy that Rav Soloveitchik really distilled very clearly, there can be the mechanical action, which is called the Maisa mitzvah, but also the Kiyama mitzvah. What are you meant to accomplish? What is the goal of that mitzvah? Right? Prayer is a great example where there's both a mechanical action. You read words, you're supposed to be able to hear them, but just reading words like lip service does not suffice. There's supposed to be a thought, an avodah shebelev, supposed to have kavanah. That's the kiyama mitzvah. There's a mechanical action, but there's also the feeling, the emotion that's supposed to be evoked as a result of that mechanical action. And Soloveitchik develops this especially by prayer, and also by the laws of Simchat Yom Tov and Avelut, right? And Avel has all types of outward expressions of his or her mourning status, right? Certain restrictions, but Soloveitchik says that that's the Maisa mitzvah, that's the mechanics. The Kiyama mitzvah is to feel, right, that mourning, as he says, mourning is an inner experience of black despair, of complete existential failure, of the absurdity of being. Soloveitchik was rather descriptive, eloquent when talking about grief. And as we know, he experienced grief in his own lifetime. Most famously after this, right, after this, with the death of his brother, his father, and his wife in close succession to one another. This didn't take place now, but it was definitely something that was part of his thinking even earlier. He says, similarly, the precept of rejoicing on a holiday refers to an all-penetrating depth experience of spiritual joy, serenity and peace of mind deriving from faith and the awareness of God's presence. It's not just, oh, we have a good bottle of Cabernet and a nice roast. No, the outward expression is supposed to evoke a certain inner experience of joy. And what Soloveitchik says, do you know where you see emotional catharsis? When a person, God forbid, loses a close relative the day before Sukkot, right? The day before Sukkot, and he buries his relative the day before Sukkot. And halacha says you're supposed to have 7 days of Shiva, that intensive, immersive experience where you can really get in touch with your grief and despair and the existential loneliness that Rav Soloveitchik says in other places. But then we say, it's Erev Yom Tov. That's it. You're done. You're done. And not only so, but again, on the flip side, if Simchat Yom Tov was just about drinking a Cabernet and eating a steak, well, mourners, Sephardim not so much. Ashkenazic mourners do that. Right? We just don't eat meat and wine before the burial. After the burial, you're allowed to. You go to Shiva house, have a glass of wine, and have meat. But it's not just the outward mechanics. It's that the internal experience doesn't work. They conflict with one another. Avelut cannot stand in the presence of Simchat Yom Tov. And when you have a Simcha, like Sukkot, which is a Simcha on the community, on the Jewish people, then we call upon the Avel. We're sorry for you. We feel bad for you. We ask you, we demand of you that you demonstrate emotional catharsis. And you're done with your Shiva. You're done with your Shiva, and you're going to experience Yom Tov. Again, to the extent to which you can do this completely, we're going to force you. Halacha is not going to recognize your Shiva any longer. It's discontinued. If it started at least before Yom Tov, then it's completely discontinued, and you experience Yom Tov like all the rest of the Jews. in solidarity and in joy. And there are some really interesting stories told about this type of emotional catharsis. Stories of Rabbanim who were informed that they lost a child on Shabbos and didn't cry until after Havdalah. What's that? That's emotional catharsis. It's this idea that Shabbos, there is no expression of mourning. Therefore, it's not going to find outward expression until halacha mandates it to. I'm not saying that that's, and Rav Soloveitchik elsewhere in the essay, the example that he gives biblically is the death of Aaron's sons, right? Vayidom Aaron, not only Vayidom Aaron, but Aaron and his sons wanted to treat themselves like onanes and not eat the carbon and not do the avoda, and Moshe gets mad at them. Who told you not to eat the carbon? That's not your role, right? That's emotional catharsis. It's natural to express devastation over the loss of two sons. Halacha, for whatever reason, is telling you not to express it in that way. You're called upon to recoil. The halacha, which at times can be very tender, understanding, and accommodating, may on other occasions act like a disciplinarian, demanding obedience. And there's a lot to unpack there. We're not going to have time, but that's the second type of emotional catharsis. Even Rav Soloveitchik acknowledges that to do this to the nth degree is difficult for most human beings, right? To really departmentalize and be like, oh, halacha says I have to be happy and I can't be sad, so I'm not going to be sad at all. But obviously, like everything else in life, there's a spectrum. The more that we can get on that spectrum away from immediately being slaves to our emotions and being more willing to respond in a halachically sanctioned and way as directed by halacha, right? That's the direction in which we want to be. The next type of catharsis that the Rav talks about is catharsis of the intellect, intellectual catharsis. And to me, I understood this as, we can look at some of the quotes. Judaism has insisted upon the redeeming of the logos of intellect and maintained that there is an unredeemed cognitive gesture, just as there is an unredeemed carnal drive, right? So eating just to fill up your stomach, we know that that's unredeemed. So too, there's a thought process or an intellectual pursuit that would similarly be viewed as unredeemed. What is that? So one way of looking at that is the pursuit of knowledge in the absence of humility, right? Where you're unwilling to acknowledge that every discovery is also opens up more questions. You focus on what you've mastered without necessarily acknowledging the questions that continue to exist. So even within the discipline of math, of science, it continues, right? It continues to grow, and every discovery is also an opportunity to acknowledge what you don't know. The more, right? What's that expression? The more I know, the more I realize I don't know things, right? Not having that perspective is unredeemed intellectual pursuit. And the other way of understanding this is something that over in the early days of COVID, my brother and I and a couple other rabbinic colleagues did a book review 5 months on books from Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. And the book that I did was Science and Religion. And Rabbi Sacks points out that science and religion ask different questions. Right? Science asks how or what, and religion asks why. Right? And so I would just add that another way of viewing unredeemed intellectual pursuit is glossing over the why, or pretending as if that's not part of it, as if the what and the how explains everything. And that's lacking a certain perspective, that's lacking a certain humility, that's lacking appreciation for the limitations on intellectual pursuit and scientific discovery. But that too is a way how do we engage in intellectual, and we can imagine that this was an emphasis that Rav Soloveitchik would have in his audience of MIT students, right? That he would want them to understand the importance of intellectual catharsis, right? The Rambam says, how do you love God? By understanding his universe. Certainly through math and science. Rav Lichtenstein beautifully makes the case, even through humanities, certainly learning history, also says understand the role of God throughout history, and even looking at good art and good literature can help us appreciate the human experience that God has created. But again, without doing so, but that could be unredeemed if not done with this catharsis of acknowledging the humility of what I know and what I don't know, and understanding that the discipline of intellectual pursuit is answering the question mostly of what, and not the theological question of why. And lastly, religious catharsis, which I think is very, very important. Just to note that Rav Soloveitchik, of course, as an intellectual himself, had studied philosophy, was studied physics, had a PhD, right? So he points out that next to the religious experience, knowledge is perhaps the most vibrant and resonant personal experience. Not surprising to see that from the Rav. It sweeps the whole of the personality, sometimes like a gentle wave, right? At other times, like a mighty onrushing tide, arousing the soul to its depths and raising it to a pitch of ecstasy. Beautifully, beautifully put. I wonder how many of our students, really, when you're studying for your tests, whether you think that way, but it should be part of our worldview. It should be part of what we preach and what we try to inculcate within our students and internalize within ourselves. The last type of catharsis is religious catharsis. Right? The idea of religious catharsis is what, again, utilizing this model that most of catharsis is about humility, even though it could be expressed as charging forward. The way that he's using it mostly in this essay is about holding back, withdrawing, recoiling. So the religious catharsis, as he points out, there is an unredeemed moral and religious experience, just as there's an unredeemed body and an unredeemed logos. Just like you can eat and engage hedonistically, you can engage, right? You can allow your emotions to spill over everything without modulating and moderating them. You can allow your intellect to have no bounds and no humility. So too, the religious experience can be similarly. Let us be candid. If one has not redeemed his religious life, he may become self-righteous, insensitive, or even destructive. Religious fanaticism. Religious fanaticism is the tragic, timely, right? 62 years later, I'm not even sure if Soloveitchik knew how right he was about what the unredeemed instinct towards religion, the destructive force that it could be. Although he did know, because there were already the Crusades. There were already many examples of religious violence well before the 21st century. Let us be candid. The story of the Crusades, the Inquisition, and other outbursts of religious fanaticism bear out this thesis. Right? So avoiding the pitfalls of religious arrogance. Religious life has its ups and downs, right? We recognize we live in the grays. Right? I remember that was an idea that I absorbed from my home and from the teachings of my Rebbeim. This idea that things are not black and white. That the religious instinct is not all good. You have to be careful. There's times that you have to hold it back. There's times you have to recognize that we grow, we fall. Sometimes we grow after we fall. Right? The greatest ascent comes after the descent. Right? And that and we should recognize that we could be wrong. We could make mistakes. And an awareness of our fallibility should cause us to avoid being self-righteous and to avoid being intolerant, right? And it also encourages us to be on the lookout for tshuva. Right? And we've talked about this Elul time, different types of tshuva. There's the type of tshuva that's in response to a mistake. Certainly, you have to be willing to acknowledge that you've made a mistake in order to engage in that type of tshuva. But there's also the tshuva that's infinite. Because if tshuva is about getting closer to God and God is infinite, then we should all be Bali tshuva. We should all engage in this process. And that's where Soloveitchik is saying that if we have this mindset of religious catharsis, that we're willing to acknowledge that the religious impulse has to be defined, has to be reined in on at times, has to be engaged in with a healthy dose of humility, then that will allow us to try to avoid the problems of the destruction of intolerance and self-righteousness. It will also allow us to be in a trajectory of religious growth, to always be looking for the opportunities to grow and to become better. The example that he gives biblically, just like he said, the example of unredeemed emotions or catharsis of emotions was the example of Aaron and his sons. Aaron not mourning his sons. The example of unredeemed religious experience, Chet Egel, right? Especially if you assume that it wasn't actual avodah zarah, but it was just their desires to be religious in a way that was not defined by what God and what Moshe had asked of them. And this is also a danger, a cautionary tale. But that's the fourth type of catharsis, of redeeming. Just to review, catharsis we would say is the ability to analyze and consider the impulsive expression of hedonism, emotions, intellect, and religion, and to do so in a way that, at least as presented by the Rav, injects a healthy dose of humility and doesn't just assume that what I feel or what I think or what I want is automatically something that I should pursue. Rather, we have to look for kedusha, hold ourselves back to have this type of redeeming self-redemption. And just to end, the hope is that through these steps of catharsis in each of these areas, each of us in our own way, that the collective will create the national redemption that we're always looking for. Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.